Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Catalyst Energies. My name is Dee. Thank you for joining me. I'm so grateful that you are here. And I am, in fact, here, even though there is no camera currently. So, welcome to this month's full moon forecast. We have a full moon in the sign of Aries, tropical or Western astrology. That will be exact as of October 6th. 2025, roughly just minutes before midnight of the 7th here in Eastern Standard Time. It is gorgeous in terms of weather here in north central Pennsylvania. Really starting to tap into the autumn season here. Beautiful, clear skies right now, at least. Certainly, there has been intermittent and very focused spraying on certain days, and then other days it's just clear as a bell. But it's clear, it's warm and sunny during the day, it's getting cooler at night, can really open some windows and air some things out. So we're going to talk about, obviously, the full moon. We're going to go back and just remind ourselves about the eclipse cycle that we're really starting to exit right now, and discuss some imagery that may be very helpful as we're closing out the eclipse cycle and really putting a lid on the time capsule that tends to be this 6-month cycle of the soul's journey. I'm going to talk about the main transits that are going to be happening at the last half of this lunar cycle, which did start with a partial solar eclipse, a south node solar eclipse, meaning that the new moon was in the sign of Virgo, which is where the current lunar south node is right now. So lots to talk about as always, but I decided not to, sometimes I decide not to turn on the camera, and there's lots of different reasons. But one of them in particular today is the honest to goodness truth is that I have a cold sore that is healing, and it tends to be very distracting, not only for me as I'm looking at myself on the screen on the camera, but sometimes it can be very distracting for other people. So I'm not embarrassed about it. It's just more of a way to keep me from being distracted while I give this transmission. Also, too, the reason I'm sharing it is because, I have a whole system of preventative methods to manage those types of symptoms. And the fact that even with all of that, there's still this type of eruption says to me, or it's more of a confirmation, honestly, that there's a very physical purge happening. I personally feel like that when these types of physical manifestations happen, they're usually the body really working hard to expel something. And I usually take that as a good sign. I mean, it's not the most it's not the most comfortable, right? Nobody wants to visually have something like this right on their face, of course, which is where everybody's looking. But I tend to think it's because the body is working very hard to expel whatever infection or whatever dormant stuff is coming up to the surface. So I'm just letting you know that there's actually a specific reason. And I do feel like that part of that is connected to the the huge bombardment of solar activity that we've been having. So if you track that at all, then you already know that we are coming off of many days of very elevated solar storm activity. And of course, the Schumann resonance in the last 2 or 3 days has certainly been elevated as well. But it's really the solar activity that I want to focus on just for a few moments because it has been substantial. It doesn't seem like it's going to be subsiding. We've had coronal hole after coronal hole after coronal hole facing us, and then linking up with our interplanetary magnetic field and getting that solar wind, right, which comes on into our magnetosphere, into our ionosphere, and bringing all that plasma into the system and bouncing all kinds of things around. The other part of this is that at equinox time, the magnetic field of the planet, even at its best, which I think it's not right now. I think that it is consistently weakening in order to prepare for some sort of movement, whether that's a pole shift or, and whether that's completely natural or not, that's a conversation for a different day. However, it is a very measured effect. It's called the Russell-McPherson effect, that at equinox times that there tends to be some vulnerability in the magnetic field, and we get more auroras, and there is more solar storm activity because the field has more cracks in it and allows in solar particles and high density plasma into our atmosphere, basically. Well, magnetosphere, ionosphere, etc. So there's been a lot of elevated solar storm activity for many days. We're going to continue with it. We're getting a little bit of reprieve right now, but that's not going to last. And considering that we're coming out of this eclipse cycle right now, this full moon, into our next new moon, which will be right on the heels of Scorpio season, I would say that we're closing, like I said, we're closing the lid right now on the eclipse cycle and the time capsule for our soul, and knowing that everything that's been transpiring over the last couple of weeks is really something that's going to find its full fruition 6 months from now, and is going to be operating deeply under the surface for all of us. That doesn't mean we don't have work to do. And in fact, the imagery of this full moon that I have showcased, one is, it's a generic AI rendering of the Sabian symbol for 15 degrees Aries, which is where this full moon is going to be. And then the stone labyrinth, or the circular paths, that is representative of where the sun in Libra is going to be at this full moon. That if I had to pick a word to ascribe to this full moon and our responsibility to our purpose and clarification of that purpose, it would be diligence. This circular path that we may there's a certain amount of maybe boredom, certainly a sense of, oh, we're here again. Yes, I suspect that that's going to be something we're all going to be dealing with in our own ways throughout the next 2 weeks, with coming back around again. And it can seem like this is getting really old, or there's no change, or I feel like I'm just spinning my wheels, going in circles. But if you look at the image of the woman weaving the blanket, is there not a consistent pattern, almost a circular pattern with a weaving, right? And the idea here is that it's possible to, sorry, I'm distracted. I'm looking at my cat out the window down by the creek. Anyway, it's possible that we can fulfill our desires, that which we, to create or manifest, if you want to think about it that way, the life that we actually want. The ceremonial blanket is something that covers us, but we have to be diligent in weaving that. It's not just going to, poof out of thin air. And I know that with the imagery of the eclipse, especially the solar eclipse, but really all of the last the last lunar cycle, the idea of like moving up this really steep staircase, right? 1 foot in front of the other, it starts to get a little old, right? Or we start to maybe feel bored, or like, are we even going to make it to the top? Is this really all that it is? 1 foot in front of the other. And, if you've ever walked a stone labyrinth, and of course this image is fairly complicated in terms of, you reach a point where it's kind of a dead end and you have to retrace your steps and then, find a different route. But even just like that simple spiral pathway of a circular labyrinth, if you've ever walked one, yes, it'll seem like that you're returning to the same, place in space. And that is partially true. But if you are walking a spiral, you also know that it's not exactly the same place. And as you continue to move along that pathway, just like as you continue to weave the blanket, whatever that blanket represents to you, eventually you find your center, and eventually you get to the end, which is the fulfillment. So Aries is about our, initially, at least the first half of Aries is about our desire. And, there's been there's no shortcuts along the pathway of spiritual awakening. As much as we'd like to think that there is some sort of shortcut, or that we can just manifest this blanket, for instance, and it's just going to poof out of thin air and be there. And boy, wouldn't that be just great, right? But as long as we're in form, we're in an incarnation, we are here in relationship to the material realm. We actually have to put the steps in order to create or manifest the reality that we want to surround ourselves with. And desire is the projection of ourselves into, it is the motivating factor that we project ourselves into the world around us in order to gain experience, gain knowledge, in order to establish a sense of power for ourselves, right? You're talking about the first four houses of the astrological wheel, right? One being Aries. So desire is not a dirty word. It's only our attachment to the outcome of that desire, and that's where the outcome is something that we can't personally control once we've entered into relationship of any kind, and that is Libra and the seventh house, right? We offer the fruits of our labor into the relationship, and how that balances out with other, and what other enters into the relationship, regardless of the relationship. That is something that we can't control. All we can control is our response to it and what we put into finding a balance. And these circular paths, I think, can either lead to a type of transpersonal peace, or it could lead to boredom that can then trigger people into basically sabotaging themselves, or giving up, or trying to find a shortcut into the center of ourselves. And this full moon is going to highlight the need for diligence in whatever it is that we are working toward right now. And so everybody's goals are different. Everybody's desire to manifest is different. Ultimately, I would like to say that when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, we all want to go back to source, to great spirit, to cultivate that relationship to the divine. And that is unique, infinitely unique to each person. But we do have to tap into that diligence in order to achieve or to manifest whatever it is that we do desire. And it is possible, right? But you have to put one foot in front of the other. And sometimes you're like, is this really all there is? Walking one step at a time up this staircase, right? Oh, another switchback? When am I ever going to get to the end? How long is it going to take to weave this blanket? Well, that's going to be different for everyone based on your experience, based on your skill level, based on how big this blanket is going to be and how intricate the design is. But it's the diligence that is really going to make the difference. And of course, we started this lunar cycle with a partial solar eclipse at the last degree of Virgo, right? Which is really, personalized diligence and mastery and patience and resoluteness, all those Virgo qualities. It's now that we've entered into relationship, that we've put our desire out there, that we have taken those steps forward in relationship. And again, that seventh house energy of Libra is whatever relationship that you are personally committed to. So it doesn't have to take the shape of anything in particular, as long as it is a personal commitment that you make and draws out your shadow, right? And that's coming up pretty strongly, I would say, with the Scorpio energy. And Mars has been moving through Scorpio. Black Moon Lilith is in Scorpio right now. So these are two energies that are very familiar with Scorpio. Mars being a ruling body, Lilith being the space within us, the emptiness within us, that primal energy. I would say that it is very familiar with the Scorpio energy of the bottomless pit, basically, of our own shadow, right? Still waters run deep. That's a very Scorpio type of way of thinking about things. And with this full moon, as we're going to see on the astrological chart, we're going to see that Mercury is coming into Scorpio. Another piece of, this next 2 weeks of change is, speaking of Scorpio, is that Pluto is finally going to station and start moving forward again. And of course, it's not really moving backwards or forwards. It's relative to our positions in our solar orbits, meaning Earth, our position, and the planet Pluto. So it's an illusion. It's a matter of perspective, but it will, from our perspective, look like it's going to start moving forward. So that's going to happen on the 13th. That is a third quarter moon. Also, along with that, Venus will move into her other home sign, which is Libra. So up to this point, Venus has been very settled into the areas about individual development, the first 6 houses of the zodiac, Aries through Virgo. When she comes into Libra, we become very sensitive to in our gut, right? In our intuition, but also we value personally, and it becomes very real, very palpable, very visceral. It's tangible with Venus. What is the balance of those relationships? And Venus is like the, justice being blind, and it's the idea here that it's in our sensitivity to the subtleties of the balance of the relationship. Your eyes can deceive you, right? But when you hold those scales, you can feel if it's balanced or not. And I think Venus coming into Libra is really going to help each of us establish that balance for ourselves and really get a sense of, like, is this balanced or not? So, of course, knowing where Libra is in your natal chart, do you have progressions in Libra? Are you a Venus-ruled person, right? Are you a Taurus sun, moon rising, or a Libra sun, moon rising? Because Venus is going to be really pushing things along for you because that's your ruling body. And then Pluto stationing direct. Mercury moving into Scorpio. One thing to keep in mind about Mercury and the mythological significance of Mercury is that Hermes, or Mercury as a mythological figure, was really the only Olympian deity that was able to go into the underworld unscathed and come back out. Nobody else was really able to do that, right? That's the realm of Hades, or the realm of Pluto. The underworld was not something that the other deities or gods of Olympus were able to really just go in and out of. Mercury, on the other hand, was able to because of the swiftness. Sometimes Mercury was considered the shepherd of souls, right? Mercury was able to guide souls safely into the underworld. So there is some, Mars has been charging ahead through Scorpio, the realms of power, the realms of the subconscious, the realms of our own shadow and our darkness, right? This is where the 8th house in Scorpio is where we feel the impact of trust and intimacy. And the other side of that is betrayal. There's also the potency of sexual union, or not even union yet, but the potency of sexual drive to procreate is part of Scorpio in the 8th house, right? Shared resources are part of Scorpio in the 8th house. So that can mean anything from, business, business beyond business contracts, but the actual money that is generated, wealth that's generated, inheritance is part of Scorpio in the 8th house. But it really has to do with raw power. And Mars, being one of the ruling bodies of this area, it's the courage and the drive to go deeper, to get more, right? And that's been really great, I think, especially if you're a Scorpio person, right? Mars coming into Scorpio has been really helpful and has given us that drive and that courage and that stamina to really go into those places. I can say for myself personally, and the things that are being reported to me just, from people in my personal orbit, dreams have been really, really strange. And I'm even hearing this more like publicly, different podcasts and influencers and stuff talking about dreams that don't seem to make any sense. I think that, yes, there is always the possibility of things being kind of inserted and wounds being poked at. But I also feel like because there's so much solar activity happening that is really pushing things up to the surface. There's been a lot, seemingly it doesn't make any sense, but maybe that's because these are old stories that have been kind of settled at the very bottom of our subconscious, right? Areas that we haven't looked at in a really long time. In fact, I mean, I've been having dreams about certain people and situations that I haven't thought about in probably decades, right? And I'm like, why am I dreaming about this person or this scenario? And it's because it's all just getting, it's all getting pulled up from the depths. And Mars has been great for that. And Mercury coming into Scorpio, I think, is going to be even better in terms of being able to rationally and with a sense of almost detachment be able to go into those spaces to clean it up or to investigate deeper, right? So one of the things, though, is that Mercury will square Pluto as it's coming into Scorpio. And so that's something to consider, that will really, that tension and friction of those two things will really propel that investigation to go deeper. And you just want to be careful not to get too obsessed with what has been let go of. It's, you don't want to, it's when you let go of a past or an identity or a situation, especially if it's been treasured or there's a sense of nostalgia about it, it can be really difficult. And that's just Mercury moving into Scorpio. Imagine now squaring Pluto in Aquarius, that is just triggering something even deeper, and people can get a little bit obsessive. So just just be mindful of that and use it to your advantage if you've been really working with doing your own shadow work, because it's ultimately in our ability to bring these two sides of ourselves together and to perform a type of spiritual alchemy in order to be healed and to be whole and to make use of that power without disempowering anybody else or ourselves. So Lilith here is certainly part of this conversation. Black Moon Lilith also being in Scorpio, along with Mars, along with Mercury. So it's going to be and we're going to come into Scorpio season right after the next new moon. So it's gone from, the idea of balance, right? It's all this Libra energy. And certainly Venus coming into Libra is going to drive it home to something very tangible. That's something that means something to us, that is valuable. It's not just an idea, which is what Mercury in Libra has been. It'll be something very tangible and meaningful and something that has, has some teeth to it with Venus, right? Something that's palpable. But then we're getting all this other energy of Mars and Mercury, and eventually the Sun moving into Scorpio, the realms of power. So keep that in mind as you are working with whatever it is you are working with, right? What is the ceremonial blanket that you're weaving, right? Because this full moon is clarifying that purpose for each of us so that we can really dig deep and continue to practice that diligence, even if there are setbacks, even if things are not moving along at the speed that we would want it to. And I think that's maybe one of the areas to watch out for with Mars and Lilith, and certainly with Mercury coming into Scorpio, is that if there's a timelessness in that space. And so we can feel the power, but it's not necessarily time yet for it to come back to renewal, right? Because Scorpio is the realm of death, right? And it's with that death that the creation comes in. And so you can think of the Hindu deity of Shiva, for instance, right? That creation requires some measure of destruction. And I'm not advocating any self-destructive behavior or to bypass any of the work by just being like, if it all blows up, then that's what we need. But it gives us some ability to recognize these natural cycles. And there's a lot of Scorpio coming into the picture. Another piece of Scorpio, and then we'll look at the chart, of course, and I want to show it to you play by play. But another piece of this scorpionic energy is that the asteroid Vesta, right, that represents the hearth flame in Roman and Greek mythology, for instance, Vesta was the goddess that represent the hearth flame, and the flame, the eternal flame, right? And so the idea, fire has a number of different phases, and the Sagittarius fire, which is where Vesta is in Western astrology, is in Sagittarius, is the hottest fire, right? It is the fire that is cooked down to the coals, but that's the fire that's hot enough to cook food, to cause actual catalytic change. And in fact, Vesta right now is not only in the sign of Sagittarius, but in terms of sidereal astrology and the constellations, it's sitting right in Antares, the star, which is the heart of the Scorpion. So there's tremendous power when we tap into that eternal flame within us. But also, too, to not get too lost in our own pain, our disillusionment. This is going to come up a bit with Venus. Venus and Mercury, both of them are going to have difficult transits with Neptune over the next 2 weeks. And Neptune, even though it's retrograde, it still doesn't mean there isn't the possibility of disillusionment, especially with what it is that we desire, right? This impulse to be, maybe to be something new, to bring something new forward. So we don't want to get too lost in this labyrinth, or think that we're not getting anywhere, that we're spinning our wheels, because we're really weaving the reality that we want to surround ourselves with, right? Which is in alignment with our higher selves, with our divine self, right? So, but this is, I don't want to say it's a warning, but this is more of a pep talk for all of us that everything is, this is going to take us out through the next 6 months, which is February, right? And that's actually when Saturn and Neptune come into their conjunction at 0 degrees Aries. Speaking of desire, right? 0 degrees Aries, they're going to come into a conjunction in February of 2026. And that's the first time they've been conjunct at 0 degrees Aries in like thousands and thousands of years. So what's coming forward is something not just new for each individual, but for humanity as well. And so knowing that everything that you do has an impact on the collective. And that's the thing about Libra. Again, it's about the relationship, and maybe it's the social relationship. It may not necessarily be, your domestic relationship, your marriage, your partnerships with your children, or your customers, your clients, right? With God, that could be it as well. But it's about that balance, and I just feel like we can get really lost in the things not happening the way, immediately. And the Scorpio energy can really kind of draw us deeper into our own despair if we're not diligent about what it is we're weaving. So I think I've belabored that message plenty, and I would love to move over now to the chart, and we're going to look at the play-by-play here. So let's transition. We're gonna, stop sharing here, share something new, which is the astrological chart. Now, before I get into this and before I forget, I just want people to, and I don't want to get too much into the specifics of, let's see here. Hold on. There we go. One thing I've learned about myself is that I cannot, for being a female, I have a really hard time multitasking. Okay, here we go. We're looking at the chart for the full moon, which is, Monday evening into Tuesday morning, Eastern Standard Time. So, but one thing I do want to bring up here before I launch into the astrology is that, so I'm making some significant changes to the Catalyst membership structure. I've already taken away the lowest tier, mostly because nobody subscribes to it, which is the $3 a month tier. And I'm leaving 2 slots open for the premium membership, which is, you get 2 collective energy readings a month that posted to the website. You get a 30% discount on all of my store, except for the packages because they're already discounted. And you get your own personal reading every single month. I'm 2 more spots open at that $9 a month, which is a huge bargain. That $9 a month rate. I'm leaving that open for 2 more subscriptions to be grandfathered in at that particular subscription rate of $9 a month before the whole structure changes and the prices for, well, the rate for the premium membership, which includes the personal reading, is going to go up significantly. So I'm leaving that open until Scorpio season starts, which is, October 22nd. The new moon is the 21st. It's going to be the very last degrees of Libra, and then the sun moves into Scorpio, and at that point I'll be closing that out. So if you want to take advantage of it, you've been considering it, you want to get more energetic readings to complement or add to or supplement these new and full moon forecasts. They are directly posted to the membership page on my website. You have your own login. You get your own dedicated discount code that you can use on the store if you want like a more in-depth reading or energy work session. And then you get your own personal reading every single month, roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, basically, just depending on timing and what's going on with me. If you've been thinking about it, now's the time to pull the trigger. $9 a month is beyond reasonable for everything that you're getting, because I need to raise those rates in order to honor the amount of energy that goes into my work. So, but you'd be grandfathered in at that $9 a month, and you will continue to get all of those amazing benefits. So, something to consider. Link in the description box if you're interested. Now let's move on to the astrology for this full moon in Aries. So, I've already gone quite enough into the imagery of the sun and the moon in terms of Sabian symbols, in terms of Western astrology for this particular full moon. So let's start moving on here, if I can. There we go, to other stuff that's going to be happening throughout. So Mercury is going, like I said, Mercury is going to be coming into Scorpio. And you can see that at the time of the full moon itself, it's moving into 0 degrees Scorpio. You can see Black Moon Lilith is, between Mars and Mercury in Scorpio. Things are going to start getting very intense in terms of, what's at the bottom of things, right? And so knowing where Scorpio is in your chart, especially if you're a strong Scorpio person like I am, you're really going to be, this is going to be familiar territory for all of us because of being very identified with the Scorpionic nature. But two things that are significant about this transition of Mercury into Scorpio is the fact that it will quincunx or in conjunct with Neptune, which is now 0 degrees Aries, and Uranus, which is still in Gemini, but also now retrograde. And so, quincunxes are square pegs in round holes, okay? They are experiences that don't seem to fit together, and your only real hope with them is to find an inner balance rather than trying to force these two elements into some sort of harmony. So that's what a quincunx really represents. It's a 150-degree angle. It is 5 out of 12. It is that last piece before the 6, especially 6 out of 12. Which is very balanced. So Mercury quincunx Neptune in particular, it's very challenging it's challenging, but the challenge is to ground our intuitive hunches, to prevent detachment from reality, right? These are all the things that can happen with Neptune, even in its retrograde, even things are glaringly clear. If we're not getting too much of the smoke and mirrors with Neptune because it's retrograde, there's still the potential, for intuitive hunches. That's great, but detachment from reality, and you want to avoid making rash decisions based on illusions. So again, if you go back to what we just talked about with the full moon and how we can get really disillusioned, how we could want to shortcut things, that's a rash decision based on an illusion that there is a way to shortcut this process. It can manifest as a need to align to your very deeply felt motivations with your personal vision, and there's a potential for sudden revelation. So that way there is something that you balance within yourself if you do kind of get these sudden revelations. But caution is really needed not to get overwhelmed, right? And so Mercury coming into Scorpio, that first degree of Scorpio is a crowded sightseeing bus on a busy city street. And so the idea of when you get on a sightseeing bus is that you're in a foreign place that is not your own, and you're widening your experience because you're gonna go and look, check out everything in this new place, right? And you're with other people who are doing the same, and it's the tour bus to hell is the way that I like to describe this first degree of Scorpio. So the fact that it's mentally and consciously feeling that widening experience, but also too, it could very easily turn into a rash decision, or getting overwhelmed or not being grounded. So that right away with the full moon, and of course it's a full moon, right? And it may not be eclipsed, but it's still a full moon, so it's very easy to get emotionally overwhelmed. And it's a full moon in Aries, so talk about like tempers flaring and flashpoints emotionally. And then on top of that, you have these quincunxes from Mercury in Scorpio. And it's not, and your hunches, your intuitive hunches with Mercury in Scorpio may be accurate. They might be on point, but the Neptune piece has us detaching from reality, or being kind of focused on the illusion as opposed to what's actually happening. So grounding is really, really important. And I heard something very recently that I was listening to about how, I think this is Ram Dass talks about how the real trick is that you have to become somebody first before you can then become nobody. You can't trick the system and just get to spiritual awakening while you're in form by not going through the steps of becoming somebody first, and then, releasing yourself from that attachment. And I think that really fits here. In terms of there's no easy way, there's no bypassing, you can't just like bypass the system. And part of being in form is you have to be in your form in order to then learn to be in the world but not of it. And he said, and in the trade, we call that being grounded. And so that's going to be really important this coming week, especially. And then right after that is when Mercury does another quincunx to Uranus. Now remember, Neptune, Uranus, these are large transpersonal planets. They represent energy that affects the collective as opposed to the individual. But it's Mercury, which is a very personal planet, our individual consciousness, that is going to feel out of alignment with these large transpersonal energies. So first it's Neptune, and then it's Uranus retrograde. So there's a tension between that very deep analytical thought, right, which is Mercury in Scorpio, and then, very disruptive inspiration. And so it's going to force the issue to adjust maybe your thought processes, maybe your communication. It certainly encourages a willingness to embrace the change and new information, right? Uranus and Gemini especially, even though it's retrograde, that new information might be much more internal of a process, but it requires a conscious effort to avoid impulsive reactions. Maintain a grounded, balanced perspective, right? If you're sitting here weaving your ceremonial blanket, you don't want to get pulled in every direction, or just be like, what, forget it, I'm not going to do it, or go figure out how you can make this blanket weave itself, or whatever. The idea here is to stay grounded, maintain that grounded, balanced perspective. You may experience a sudden influx of information, innovative ideas. Oh, maybe I can do it this way, you may reevaluate your approach. That's what I'm trying to spit out here. To understanding information, connecting with technology. Of course, that's Uranus and Gemini. But the idea here, again, is to maintain a grounded, balanced perspective as these large transpersonal energies are making internalized change. This is what retrogrades seem to really be about, is that the internalized process, okay? So that's like right out the gate. And of course, at the same time, the Mercury square Pluto, right, that I already talked about, very intense, transformative communication, deep seated psychological truths are forced into the open. That's been happening, right? I think that the solar weather, that it's been intense and it's been uncomfortable, but it is really pushing things up into the open. And yes, communication breakdowns, power struggles, absolutely. That's everywhere. And brings hidden agendas and personal power dynamics to the surface. And we have to be honest about things. We have to confront things honestly and have a willingness to let go of the control so that we can navigate this really intense emotional landscape. So Mercury square Pluto is going to force these issues, right? Confronting what needs to be restructured in our own lives and in the collective life, right? Uncomfortable truths emerging. So that's nothing new to a lot of us, but just keep in mind that maybe this is happening for other people and you're in a position to be the grounded person and, really be able to interface with those dark areas of truth in a grounded and balanced way as other people might have going through a crisis as they are encountering the darker side of a situation or their own humanity, for instance. So the upside to this is the urge to dig deeper, and you're going to really see that people are going to continue to want to get to the truth about things or investigate the truth or get to the bottom of something as more and more truth or darkness starts to come to the surface. So it's a really great time to uncover secrets. The best thing you can do in a situation like this, and boy, have I been feeling this, is taking the high road, right? Maintaining an open mind, I would say, and a compassionate heart. I also feel like that's going to be really, really helpful. Refraining from arguing for the sake of arguing, right? Maybe just giving someone space to let them go through their own process and just be present with them and love them for who they are, even if you know that what they're expressing is really the worst parts of themselves, and for your own self, not just other people. You might be going through this as well. So, and then the moon will continue to move through Aries. So that'll be fun, right? Again, this is always a time of flash temper flares, emotional, flaring, things like that. Certainly there may be the sun flaring even more, but the moon in Aries, it's more of our own internal waters that'll be boiling. So or just being a medium for that electrical current. So just keep that in mind too. One of the good things about this time period in the next 2 days is that on the 8th, so let's move ahead here to, I'm having a real hard time with my computer seems to be really struggling with being able to keep up with moving between tabs. So hopefully everything is still recording. I'll be really sad if it's not. Let's move ahead to the 8th because Venus is going to sextile Jupiter, which is a really very beneficial, very benevolent, and especially because Venus is in Virgo, Jupiter is in Cancer. This is a really nice transit that'll give us a lot of pleasant, loving, and creative influence, right? It encourages cooperation, it encourages peace and harmony. Jupiter is really happy in Cancer. In fact, Jupiter is going to retrograde in Cancer, so it's going to be here for a while, which is really nice. It may be a little bit too insular when it's retrograde, but we'll deal with that when we get there. You should feel warm and happy inside when Venus sextile Jupiter. I would say even a sense of kind of innocence, childlike innocence with Venus and Virgo. And, you want to share good feelings. You feel warm and happy inside. You want to socialize. Great time for either making friends, hanging out with people. Mutually beneficial and genuine connections can happen with Venus sextile Jupiter. It's just a really good transit. You just the tendency towards excess and overindulgence is always high when you have Venus and Jupiter together. So just keep an eye on those things. If you have a sweet tooth, this could easily turn into that. Addictive substances of all kinds, right? And just, you feel like you can just handle the indulgence, but Yeah, just be mindful, especially Venus and Virgo, right? You don't want to like give up on all the discipline and work that you've really done on, your body and your physical self this whole time. So ultimately, though, this creates a very harmonious blend of practicality with Venus and Virgo and nurturing. So with the Jupiter and Cancer. So fostering growth in relationships, things like creativity, personal values, it's gonna be really nice. And then the moon will be in Taurus as well, which is also exalted. The moon in Taurus, and so emotionally we just settle into the world around us, right? Just like the water seeping into the soil. It's quite wonderful, actually. That doesn't mean there won't be issues, right? It's going to square Pluto, be opposite Mercury. It's going to be opposite all of that Scorpio energy, which is Mercury, Lilith, and Mars. So that's something to consider too, that you might find some irritability, impulsiveness, and emotional volatility with all of these oppositions to the Scorpio energy. And it's because emotionally we just kind of want to be like Ferdinand the Bull and just like sit back and chill. And all that Scorpio energy is really going to challenge that. So just keep that in mind as well, especially when it's opposite Mercury, because then you get confused and irritable, and it's hard to relax, and you become very over analytical, especially Mercury and Scorpio. You're really going to be like, no, we got to get to the bottom of this and really get to the truth of something. And the moon in Taurus is going to be like, it will fulfill when it is time to be fulfilled, right? So you're just going to have to lean into that discomfort. You don't necessarily want to, again, you don't want to bypass everything and just be like, I'm just going to settle into like my slothful nature over here emotionally. But you don't want to necessarily just give in to all of this intense scorpionic energy while the moon is in Taurus. There's something to be said here for being able to just emotionally chill out, and be patient and be settled and just be, right? Because that's the thing about Taurus, is you just be, right? Because right after that, there's going to be more quincunxes. Venus will quincunx Chiron. The sun is going to have an inconjunct with the North Node, and then Venus will be in an opposition to Saturn. And I think this is something worth looking at too. This is going to happen on the 11th, so that'll be next weekend, leading up to our third quarter moon and Pluto stationing direct. I think that's going to be really the capstone of this whole second lunar half here, is that Pluto stationing direct. But right before that happens, Venus is going to be opposite Saturn. So this is always one of those situations where there are delays and there's loneliness, there's limitations. You feel, it's not good for socializing, alone time. You may be pressured by people, and, you may feel like your efforts are being overlooked, especially with Venus and Virgo. You've been working very hard on yourself, especially in terms of your physicality, your value, material possessions, right? All of the things that Venus represents, relationships, and this opposition to Saturn is, you may find yourself really just not being acknowledged for whatever reason. And so maybe you're going to have to just do it. Focus on what you can do. And maybe in order to show that you care is to keep working hard, do practical things, stay in alignment with what has been established and working. Try to identify where you're responsible for things and work on that, right? It's really easy to focus on what other people are doing or not doing that is contributing to a situation that is negative or uncomfortable. And I have found that when that's happening and I personally can't really do anything, I focus on myself and where I can make change. And it's not that you're, letting somebody off the hook for their behavior or their choices, but you are kind of pulling your resources in and focusing on your own development. So this is a great time with Venus opposite Saturn to do that type of stuff. And if you are subject to depression, many of us are, this may not be the best day, right? You may be feeling the cosmic blues. It happens. So know that it's going to pass. I always say, and that's, how I am with, my own depression at this point. I know that it's not forever. Just like you can say that like your elation, for instance, or, a moment of happiness is also not forever. These are transient experiences as part of being in form, right? So if you're feeling depressed or you're prone to depression, this is the type of transit that can really aggravate that. And so just know that, what are your self-care techniques? What are the ways that what are your coping skills when you're getting into that space? You support yourself, do the things that nurture and soothe you so that you don't get trapped in your loneliness or your sadness because things are not happening or you're not being acknowledged for all the hard work that you've done. It's very possible that could come about. And because when we get to the third quarter moon, obviously that's a crisis point in and of itself, is a third quarter moon. It's a crisis of consciousness. But along with that, Pluto's going, and this is the 13th, right? Seems pretty auspicious. At least it's not a Friday, I suppose. Pluto's going to station on the 13th. Venus will move into Libra as well. And so we'll become very sensitized to the actual balance of relationships themselves. As you can see, Lilith will have moved and in her retrograde also back into Libra. That'll probably be a little bit helpful as well to kind of take some of the intensity off of how our feels and back into the realm of the mind and a mental construct of how things are balanced or not balanced. In fact, it'll be on the 13th. Lilith will be conjunct Arcturus. And for those of you who are Arcturian starseeds or you're familiar with Arcturus from that perspective, from galactic astrology, this placement indicates individuals that have a very deep philosophical understanding of how everything is organized and are very adept at not managing, but structuring and designing and building any type of structure in a way that maximizes the natural flow of the energy and achieves balance and harmony. So it'll be helpful to have Lilith there, but also it could work against us, just like Lilith usually does, that if we can't feel that, if we cannot personally initiate that, then we will try to force the issue. So just be aware of that too, that you can't necessarily force other people into doing anything. And this goes along with the Venus opposite Saturn energy that'll still be present coming into, I would say, the 13th. So oh, and the moon will be in Cancer, which is its home sign. So just keep in mind, wow, the moodiness and the feels will be off the charts at that time as Pluto is stationing. So let me find my notes here. Okay. Pluto stations direct, third quarter moon in Cancer. Venus will enter Libra, and then it will come into immediately an opposition with Neptune. Okay, so another difficult connection to Neptune. First, it was Mercury at the full moon in a quincunx to Neptune, and now Venus is opposite Neptune. And again, more problems with relationship stuff, and more likely to fall victim to predators who seeking to take advantage of your caring and accepting nature, especially Venus and Libra, because that first degree is like, here's the archetypal human made sacred, right? This is the perfection of the human condition at 1 degree Libra, and opposite Neptune. People may see that as a weakness when you appear more loving or generous or just balanced than they are. So, but you can also, over-idealize situations. You can be gullible, which can lead to embarrassment or disappointment or financial losses that harm your self-esteem. All of these oppositions, or Venus opposite Neptune, all of these things are a possibility. So you just want to be aware of the potential here in this situation. And there's really no time to be a martyr, I would say. And with Venus in Libra, you just you work with things, especially in Libra, things that you can do to establish balance in your life or your home or yourself, right? Whatever that is, right? Maybe you need to practice some cleaning or some feng shui in your space, right? Maybe there is, maybe just making something creative that allows you to establish that type of balance in your life, whatever it is. A more spiritual approach to your self-image would be beneficial as well. And this really does encourage a balance between collaborative efforts and personal needs. And so that's one way that you can work with this energy as well. Because again, the potential here for just not being realistic and being more focused on like the perfection of things can really work against us. And then the Pluto stationing, that is the demolition machine turning back on, which is why I feel like this is kind of like the capstone of this whole transmission here, is that when Pluto stations and starts moving forward, you're going to really start seeing things like turn back on. So if you remember the last time Pluto was at this degree, which is 1 to 2 degrees 1 to 2 degrees of Aquarius, the most significant transit of this that I remember is on Inauguration Day when the Sun and Pluto were conjunct at this degree. So just keep that in mind as well as we move into a period where Pluto turns back on, so to speak, right? And that's going to be on the 13th or that third quarter. Now, of course, Venus coming into Libra means that there will be a trine to Uranus and a trine to Pluto on the 14th, which is, trines are usually very balanced. Sometimes they can be, make us a little lazy, especially Venus. She loves to be lazy. And you can see this grand air trine right here, actually, on the chart. And so, trine Uranus, especially, an air trine to Uranus, you kind of get this urge to try something new. There's some kind of experimentation when it comes to your relationships and freedom, right? Because that's what Uranus represents. Now, Uranus is retrograde. So, I think that what this trine could really represent for people is a new, a completely new view of who we can be, a new dimension of being that the first degree of Gemini represents, and how that can apply to this position within ourselves, either within ourselves, within our relationships of perfection, right? That's the 0 degrees of Libra. Is the perfect archetypal human, right? The sacred human in that moment. And this trine to Uranus, I think, will allow us the opportunity to try something new, to have our affections be stimulated, have something new be stimulated under this influence. And then the trine to Pluto right after that just adds the intensity. And at this point, Pluto will be direct as Venus is in a trine to it. So you're starting to feel deeper connection to people, the intimacy, the passion will be that much more. Now, you could become a little bit more obsessed with Venus trine Pluto. That's always a possibility. But I would say that it really is just kind of give a little, a turbo boost in some ways to the intensity and passion of the relationship, and crossing a threshold, if that makes sense, right? Of where you've been and where you're going. And in this moment, it's like, sometimes it's the things we don't expect that come through and really challenge our resilience. And in that awareness, we can see where we've been and the potential of where we're going. And it's going to be very palpable. It's going to really come back to like actual meaning and value to us when we're talking about Venus. The Sun is going to square Jupiter and be opposite Chiron right after this as well. This is just a couple days after. And this is, these types of squares and oppositions are just going to, in fact, it's a T-square. So whenever we have a T-square, we definitely want to look at the point of the ghost point of the grand square, so to speak, which is over here in Capricorn. But this T-square really just encourages to confront our insecurities. When we're talking about Chiron and Aries, the square to Jupiter is like a double-edged sword. You can feel very confident and proud and optimistic, but you could also be cocky about it, right? You could get too optimistic and superior and confident. So you want to make sure that you practice some moderation, and this may manifest as a struggle between, the need for emotional expression, which is Jupiter in Cancer, and maintaining a balanced approach to relationships. And so, you could find all of these things coming up to the surface with this T-square. And Capricorn is the ghost point here, especially the last degrees of Capricorn. These are all very galactic degrees, by the way. You're talking about energy that is more responsible, that has to do with the cohesion of the whole, not just about how we feel, not just about our wounds, but how we make the most of these things. And that really, kind of balances out the full square that we need to deal with. And I think not forgetting that Capricorn energy. It doesn't mean that we put all of these things aside. It means that when we successfully and honestly and maturely investigate and approach these issues of the need for emotional expression and how we maintain a balanced approach to relationships and fairness and how we deal with our own wounds, the piece that we don't want to miss is how that affects the whole. Right? And if we can keep that in mind, then I think we'll be doing okay, because the only way out is through, right? No more bypassing. And then on the 20th, right before the new moon, so as we're coming into the balsamic phase here, Mercury and Mars will be conjunct at 20 degrees of Scorpio. And this is where we really plunge ahead into the unknown, right? We pull back the curtain, so to speak, and move into territory that we've never been in before. And then we'll be moving, at our balsamic moon phase, and then we'll be moving into the next lunar period, and we'll really put a close, I think, at this point with the eclipse time capsule, right? This whole 2 weeks is like us really clarifying our purpose and putting that diligence into action. And when we get to this point at the balsamic moon and Mercury and Mars are together, we're going to really, we know that we've put a cap on, or a lid on this time capsule. We've put it in its place. We know that in 6 months it's going to bring forward, the fruits of all of that. And we are making a conscious and very dedicated decision to pull the curtains apart and plunge ahead into the unknown, right? Walk the sacred pathway. And it'll be something that we have the courage to do, and we have the conscious awareness and capacity to do with Mercury and Scorpio. So that's going to take us up to the next new moon, which will be at 29 degrees Libra, and that will be on the 21st of October. We'll be moving into Scorpio season after that, and it will be all very intense. But like I said, I think that what is the capstone of all of this is Pluto stationing direct on the 13th as Venus comes into Libra. And, it'll become very real and palpable just how balanced things really are, or unbalanced, they really are. Like what it is that needs to change in order to establish a sense of social balance or relationship balance, or even just a balance within ourselves, right? It just depends on where you find Libra in your chart. So, my friends, thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate all of you so very much. Again, a reminder, if you're interested in the premium Catalyst, and you're interested in any Catalyst membership, but if you're interested in the premium, because you do get that personal reading every single month, to be grandfathered in at the $9 a month rate, please consider signing up within the next 2 weeks, because that will not be available after the 22nd of October. Of course, my email is in the description box if you have any questions or concerns, and everything else you need is in that description box below. I am always accepting donations if you are not in a position to consistently subscribe to any content, but you do want to show your appreciation for the free content that I put out. There are Venmo and PayPal links in the description box, and that is always appreciated, because the internet is not free. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all of you so very much. To the Catalyst membership, I'll be seeing you next week for your Catalyst energy reading. And to those who are, it's time for your personal reading, you'll be hearing from me as well. Till then, have a wonderful, just energized full moon. Don't forget about the diligence that is necessary to weave the reality that you want to wrap yourself in. And I think we're going to get there. Take care, everyone.